Hi everyone, I'm Kye and welcome again to my kitchen. Today I'm going to show you how to make some amazing pie crust from scratch, because being able to make homemade pie crust is an impressive technique you can whip out anywhere. You only need 3 ingredients plus some water, and you can use it to make so many things. So similar to bread dough, we showed you how to knead bread dough last week. There's no one right way to make pie crust. So if you have a method that you learned from your grandma, or you have a recipe that you love and you go to, awesome, use it, go for it. I'm gonna show you the method that we teach in the King Arthur Baking School. So if you want to try something different, if you're not totally happy with your pie crust, if you want something a little bit flakier or a little different, then I invite you to come try this. The recipe that I'm using today to show you how to make pie crust is our all butter pie crust, because that's what I have on hand. But if you love shortening, or maybe you like using lard, you can use our classic double pie crust recipe. And the techniques that we're going to master today, you can use them across any pie crust recipe you want. So again, baking's like ballet, so practice those fundamentals and then you can dance your dance, sing your song, and it'll be a little bit different and it'll still come out great. So in my bowl, I have about 300 grams of all-purpose flour, and we also have a teaspoon of salt. And one of the first mistakes that people make about pie crust before they even get started is they're nervous. And pie crust is like a shark. They can smell fear. So just know that you're gonna need to practice probably a few times before you make the perfect pie crust, but you can do this. It's 4 ingredients. You're gonna learn everything you need to know today. So just go in with confidence, and I promise it will turn out better if you do. So I'm opening up 2 sticks of butter, which is 227 grams. This butter is very cold from the fridge. It's not frozen. Some recipes call for freezing butter. I've found that when you're trying to incorporate frozen butter into your dry mixture, it tends to break and crack, unless it's a super high fat butter, like an 83% European. That's a little bit more pliable. If you're just using regular grade A butter, it should be from the fridge. What you wanna do is chop your butter into small chunks. And I'm going to show you a method that incorporates the fat into 2 additions. This all butter pie crust recipe, it just calls for 1 addition. You add all the butter at once, but I'm gonna show you the perfectionist technique. You can use it all at once, or you can use this 2 addition method. The 2 addition method for the fat gives your crust both tenderness and also flake. So what we're doing with the first addition, I'm just mixing up my dry ingredients. Now I've cut this butter into cubes about this size, and we're adding it in. Now I'm gonna use my hands to rub the butter into the flour until it's pretty incorporated. The flour will start to look a little bit yellow. There won't be a lot of big chunks. I'm not trying to make the butter disappear at all, but I do want it to work in. And so what this step is doing is it's coating the flour with the butter, and that will prevent any tough gluten strands from forming. That gives you a really delicate pie crust that's really delightful to eat. And you can do this step with shortening or with lard, and it will do that same thing. It will just really ensure that the final pie crust is really, really tender. And then when we add this second stick of butter, we're gonna cut the chunks a little bit larger, and we're not going to fully incorporate it. We're just going to press with our thumb and forefinger and flatten the chunks into these beautiful leaves of golden butter. That's where the flake comes from. So with the 2 addition method, you get the tenderizing and you get the flake. One of the common mistakes that new pie crust makers begin with is they don't use cold ingredients. So in order for the pie crust to really have that flakiness in the oven, you want to use cold ingredients. My water here also had an ice cube in it. It's pretty hot here today in Vermont, so it actually has already melted, but you do want to start with really cold ingredients. So I've incorporated my first batch of butter about as much as I want to. We can still see that there are some chunks, but it also looks a little bit yellow. So now it's time for the second stick of butter, which is cut into bigger chunks. And you want to work quickly while you're making pie crust. Newbie bakers might be a little bit nervous and work really slowly, but everything is gonna warm up, your butter will get melty, and it'll just become more difficult to handle. So what I'm doing with these larger chunks of butter is flattening them into leaves. I'm using lobster fingers like this to just kind of press. You don't want to do too much smearing, but these big chunks can just be flattened. This is where you don't want to use frozen butter, otherwise it would be a losing battle and your pie crust would probably win. So I'm looking for pieces that are about this size. In the baking school, we say one of the secrets to the best pie crust is VB, or visible butter. So you want to be able to see these gorgeous flakes of deliciousness in the final crust. So now we are almost ready to add our water. Our pie crust recipes usually give a range of water because it depends on the condition of the environment. Is it really humid? Is it dry? And that will change how much water you need. And I would say the number one mistake that bakers make when making pie crust is they add too much water, because it can be nervous if your pie crust is really shaggy and dry looking. You want to make it look gorgeous, so you add more water. When you add more water, more gluten forms and the pie crust becomes really tough. So start by just using a little bit of water. I've already measured this out. This was very cold. Now that my butter is all pretty much flattened, it's okay if there's big chunks. I mean, look at some of this. We're just gonna sprinkle really lightly, maybe about half of the water. I'm gonna use my fingers to kind of toss this around. You can also use this tool, the bench scraper or the bowl scraper, and just kind of toss it. You can also use a pastry blender for the initial cutting in steps. Once that first batch of water is incorporated, I start to make the dough come together on one side of the bowl to show what parts of the crust really are dry and need to be hydrated more readily. Some people like to use a tablespoon or a teaspoon to sprinkle the water in so that they don't get carried away, to prevent them from making that tragic mistake of using too much water. You do want to be gentle with your pie crust once the water is added. If you're too rough, if you treat it like bread dough, you also are more likely to end up with a good amount of gluten and get that tough, chewy texture. That is not what we're going for here. So at this point, I'm going to use my hands and kind of bring it together once more. This white, dry, powdery stuff still needs a little bit more water, but I'm probably not going to need it all because it is summer here. And so it is pretty humid. Just kind of add this in. That looks pretty good. And now we're ready to turn it out of our bowl. You'll notice I didn't do any kneading. You don't really need to knead pie crust. You need pie crust, but you don't need it like bread dough. You need it in your life, in your belly. So now what I'm going to do is use a piece of parchment paper. This is helpful, but not essential. You can use a piece of plastic wrap if you don't have parchment. But once you have this mass, and remember, this is not beautiful pie dough. Like a lot of new bakers would freak out and say, this is a mess, like what am I doing? No, this is right. This is on track because you don't want to use too much water. So scrape your ingredients out. Do not panic at this step. Don't panic. Remember, pie crust is like a shark. It smells fear. Have confidence, okay? This is gonna turn gorgeous in just a few moments with just one technique. So I'm going to use the palms of my hands to flatten the dough, using my other hand to kind of smooth out the edges. This will prevent the dough from cracking and having as many cracks. It already looks so much better. Now, this is where magic happens. We're gonna use the parchment and fold the pie crust over onto itself and press down, giving it some pressure to come together. And by making this folding motion, we are making layers, people. We are making flaky, flaky layers, and your pie crust is going to be amazing. You can make about 3 or 4 folds if you want. Just listen to the pie crust, do what it wants. If it's starting to stick, you can use your dough scraper to go like this. And it always is amazing to me, like my pie crust looks so dry and it's sticking, which means that maybe I even could have held back a little bit more. So I'm gonna do one more fold and just incorporate any errant bits like this. And then I'm going to get out a piece of plastic wrap or your favorite reusable wrap and divide it in half because this is a double pie crust. And I am going to put it in the fridge for up to 3 days, or you can freeze it for quite a while. If you are going to put it in the fridge, it's really helpful to put a little bit of acid in your water, like lemon juice or vinegar, and that just tenderizes and prevents the dough from turning gray. It can oxidize a little bit. It tastes just fine. It just turns a little gray if you wait 3 days before you start baking with it. One last thing to keep in mind, and don't make this mistake, if you are making something like an apple pie that has a bottom crust and a top crust, you want one piece of dough to be bigger than the other. Because if you think about your pie crust, it has the bottom and then the sides. So you want that piece to be larger, whereas the top only needs to go all the way to the edges so that you can crimp it. So I'm making quiche with these, and so I'm going to have 2 single crusts, so I did mine roughly in half. But if you're making something delicious that needs a top crust, consider your ratios before you wrap them up. So I'm just gonna get some plastic wrap, roll it, make it into a nice disc and roll it on the edges like this. And this kind of will prevent the dough from cracking along the edges because you get a nice smooth edge. I'm going to date it and I'm going to put it in my fridge. And then tomorrow I'm going to show you guys how to roll out and crimp pie crust like a pro. So master this technique, you guys got this. I know you can do it. Remember, just 4 ingredients. Have confidence, use cold ingredients. Work quickly and you will have amazing pie crust in no time. Thanks, guys.